Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You'd help your family if they were in trouble, right? That's what I thought too, without hesitation, without second guessing, without any nagging doubt whispering in the back of my mind. When my parents called me that evening, their voices heavy with worry, my mother's tone edged with desperation, I barely let them finish before I reached for my laptop to transfer the money. She told me their house needed emergency repairs, that a pipe had burst in the basement, that water damage was spreading fast, that if they didn't act immediately, the costs would spiral out of control. My father chimed in, his voice unusually quiet, like he hated having to ask me for help, like this was a last resort and they had exhausted every other option. I swallowed down a sigh because I knew this wasn't the first time they had come to me in need, and deep down, I suspected it wouldn't be the last. Still, they were my parents, and I was their daughter, the responsible one, the stable one, the one they could always count on. That was how it had always been, ever since I graduated college, landed a good job, built a life without needing to lean on them for support. My younger sister, Emily, was the opposite, restless, impulsive, never quite able to get herself together, always running from one disaster to the next with our parents there to cushion every fall. I didn't ask questions because that's what a good daughter does. I didn't push for details or demand proof because trust is supposed to mean something between family. So I opened my banking app, wired $10,000 to their account, and told them it was no big deal, even though it was. Even though it was a chunk of my savings that I had worked hard for, money that I had set aside for emergencies of my own, money I hadn't planned to just hand over without a second thought. My mother's gratitude came quickly, but something about her tone made me pause. It was too casual, too light, as if the weight of the situation had vanished the second the money was on its way. "Thank you, sweetheart, you have no idea how much this helps," she said, her voice breezy, the stress that had been thick in her words moments ago now entirely absent. My father muttered something about paying me back as soon as they could, but I didn't hold my breath. That was never how this worked. We said our goodbyes, and I sat there for a long time staring at my phone, willing myself to believe that I had done the right thing, that they really had needed my help, that this wasn't just another instance of them taking advantage of my reliability. But the unease in my gut wouldn't fade, a whisper of doubt curling around my ribs, tightening just enough to make me uncomfortable. The feeling stayed with me the next morning when I went to work, and it lingered in the back of my mind as I went about my day, a quiet but persistent itch that I couldn't quite scratch. It wasn't until later that evening, when I was mindlessly scrolling through social media, that the unease twisted into something sharper, something sickening, something that made my blood run cold. There it was. A post. Bright, bold, impossible to ignore. Emily, stretched out on a sun-drenched beach, a cocktail in hand, smiling at the camera with the kind of relaxed ease that people only have when they have no worries in the world. The caption was what sent my stomach plummeting. "Thanks, Mom and Dad. Best surprise ever." My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else, my eyes locked onto those words, reading them over and over, hoping I had misunderstood, hoping that there was some explanation that would make sense. But there wasn't. There were no emergency repairs. No burst pipes. No water damage threatening to ruin their home. There was only this. A $10,000 vacation. A trip that my parents had paid for. With my money. I stared at my phone screen, my heart pounding hard against my ribs, my fingers gripping the device so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my breath coming short and shallow as I tried to process what I was seeing. The bright, sunlit beach stretched endlessly behind Emily's perfectly relaxed form, the waves lapping gently at the shore, the sky a flawless shade of blue that seemed almost mocking in its serenity. She looked utterly carefree, sprawled out on a cushioned lounge chair, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, a fruity cocktail in one hand as if she didn't have a single concern in the world. The caption beneath the image was like a slap across my face, sharp and undeniable, cutting through any remaining hope that I had misunderstood the situation. "Thanks, Mom and Dad. Best surprise ever." The words burned into my brain, each letter searing with the realization that I had been lied to, manipulated, used in the most shameless way possible. My parents had come to me with panic in their voices, begging for money to fix a crisis that didn't exist, painting a picture of desperation and urgency, making it sound as if their home was falling apart around them. But the only thing falling apart in that moment was the illusion that I had held onto for so many years, the belief that, despite everything, they saw me as more than just a convenient source of financial support. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the comments beneath the photo, each one a fresh insult to my intelligence, a reminder of how easily they had deceived me. Friends and acquaintances gushed over how lucky Emily was, how amazing my parents were for treating her to such a luxurious getaway, how much she deserved to be spoiled after everything she had been through. I wanted to scream, to throw my phone across the room, to erase every trace of the betrayal that was now glaringly obvious. Instead, I did the only thing that made sense. I called my mother. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice warm and light, as if she had no idea that her carefully constructed lie had just unraveled before my eyes. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her tone so casual that it made my stomach twist, a sharp contrast to the desperate plea she had fed me just days before. "How's your day going?" I didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't waste a single second pretending that everything was fine, didn't give her the satisfaction of thinking she had gotten away with it. "Emily's on vacation," I said, my voice controlled but cold, my words sharp enough to cut. "A luxury vacation that you and Dad paid for." There was a beat of silence, just long enough for me to picture the exact expression that must have flickered across her face, the brief widening of her eyes, the slight pursing of her lips, the momentary panic before she smoothed it all over with practiced ease. "Oh, honey," she finally said, her voice filled with forced patience, as if I were being unreasonable, as if I were the one overreacting. "Emily deserved a break. She's been under so much stress lately, you have no idea how hard she's had it." I almost laughed, the sheer audacity of her response knocking the breath from my lungs, but the bitter amusement was quickly swallowed by something darker, something heavier. "She's been stressed?" I repeated, the words foreign and ridiculous as they left my mouth. "And that somehow justifies lying to me? Taking my money under false pretenses and using it to fund her vacation?" Another pause, this one more deliberate, as if she were choosing her words carefully, calculating exactly how to spin this in a way that would make me feel guilty instead of furious. "We didn't think you'd understand," she said finally, her voice carrying that familiar note of exasperation, the one she always used whenever she wanted to dismiss my feelings as irrational. "You've always been so independent, so responsible, so put together. But Emily's different, sweetheart. She struggles in ways you never had to, and sometimes she just needs a little extra help." A sharp, biting memory rose unbidden in my mind, an echo of a childhood spent watching the same pattern play out over and over again. Emily, crying over a bad grade, and my mother smoothing back her hair, telling her it wasn't her fault, that she was still special, that she'd do better next time. Me, coming home with straight A's, only to be met with a distracted nod, an absent-minded good job before my achievements were pushed aside in favor of whatever new crisis Emily had managed to create. I could hear my father shifting in the background, his discomfort practically radiating through the phone, his reluctance to intervene a painfully familiar routine. "It wasn't meant to hurt you," he muttered, his voice low, hesitant, as if he knew how pathetic the excuse sounded even as he spoke it. "We just wanted to do something nice for her. You're doing so well for yourself, we thought you wouldn't mind helping out this once." The sheer absurdity of the statement made my skin prickle with rage, but I didn't let it explode, didn't give them the satisfaction of hearing me snap. Instead, I swallowed down every bitter word that threatened to spill from my lips, pressing them into a silence that was far more powerful than any argument I could have thrown their way. "Okay," I said simply, my voice devoid of emotion, my decision already forming in the back of my mind. And that silence terrified them more than anything else ever could. Have your parents ever treated you like an ATM, expecting you to hand over money whenever they needed it while giving your sibling everything on a silver platter? Have you ever felt like no matter how much you worked, saved, and planned for your own future, you were still nothing more than a financial safety net for people who never truly appreciated your efforts? I used to believe that being responsible, independent, and financially stable would earn me respect, but instead, it just made me an easy target. The realization burned in the back of my mind as I sat there, phone still in my hand, my mother's casual dismissal of my anger replaying over and over in my head like a broken record. They didn't just lie to me, they didn't just manipulate me, they did it without a second thought, without an ounce of guilt, without even the courtesy of making their deception convincing. I knew that if I confronted them again, if I yelled or demanded my money back, they would only twist the situation, paint me as cold-hearted, selfish, unwilling to support my own family. They had done it before in smaller ways, guilt-tripping me whenever I hesitated to help, making me feel like a bad daughter for setting boundaries, for expecting even the smallest amount of honesty in return. This time, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of controlling the narrative. This time, I would handle things differently. If they wanted to see me as nothing more than a resource to be used at their convenience, then I would show them just how costly their mistake had been. Instead of confronting them outright, I played along. I forced a smile when my mother called the next day, pretending that I wasn't still seething beneath the surface, responding with an easy, "I get it, Mom, I really do." I even went so far as to like and comment on Emily's vacation photos, throwing in an enthusiastic, "Looks amazing. Hope you're having the best time," because I knew my parents were watching. I could practically hear the self-satisfied relief in my mother's voice the next time she called, the way she subtly tried to reinforce the idea that I had overreacted, that everything was fine now, that she had successfully swept the whole mess under the rug. But while they were busy thinking they had gotten away with it, I was already several steps ahead. I knew my parents' financial situation wasn't as stable as they liked to pretend. They had never been the best with money, always living just a little beyond their means, making decisions based on immediate gratification rather than long-term security. My father, who had always handled their finances, was old-fashioned in his reluctance to embrace online banking, preferring paper statements and in-person transactions, which meant he had no idea how easy it was for me to gather the information I needed. A few polite inquiries with their bank, a strategically worded conversation with an old friend who worked in lending, and I had everything I needed to confirm what I had already suspected. My parents weren't just struggling, they were drowning. They had maxed out their credit cards, taken out loans they were barely managing to keep up with, and were only one unexpected expense away from financial disaster. My $10,000 hadn't just been a convenient handout, it had been their last lifeline, the one thing standing between them and the consequences of their own recklessness. And now, they had nothing left. I had always known that my parents were good at lying, at twisting the truth just enough to suit their needs, at crafting excuses that blurred the line between manipulation and genuine concern. But I had never realized just how easy it was for them to do it until now. They had looked me in the eye and told me their home was falling apart, had practically begged me to help them before it was too late, had spun a story so detailed that I never even thought to question it. But now that I knew the truth, now that I had undeniable proof that my money had never gone toward repairs, but had instead paid for my sister's luxury vacation, I was done playing the role of the naive, trusting daughter. Still, I wasn't going to confront them in a fit of rage, wasn't going to give them the chance to paint me as dramatic or unreasonable, wasn't going to let them turn this into yet another situation where I was somehow the one in the wrong. Instead, I did exactly what they would least expect. I invited them to dinner. I made it sound casual, as if I just wanted to catch up, as if I hadn't spent the last few days meticulously planning my revenge. My mother sounded delighted when she agreed, her voice warm and affectionate, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. My father, always the quieter of the two, merely muttered his agreement, probably relieved that I wasn't still asking questions about the money. When they arrived at the restaurant, all smiles and false warmth, I greeted them like nothing was wrong, like I wasn't already 10 steps ahead of them, like I wasn't about to turn the tables in a way they would never see coming. I let my mother gush about Emily's trip, let her ramble on about how much my sister had needed the break, how wonderful it had been for her to finally relax, how lucky she was to have parents who cared so much about her happiness. I listened with a pleasant expression, nodding in all the right places, waiting until the perfect moment to strike. "So, how's the house doing?" I asked, my voice light, my tone perfectly neutral, as if the question was nothing more than a passing thought. "I know you said the water damage was really bad. Did the contractors finish everything already?" The shift in my mother's expression was so slight that most people wouldn't have noticed it, just the faintest flicker of hesitation before she forced a smile, just the tiniest pause before she rushed to respond. "Oh, well, you know how these things go," she said, waving a hand dismissively, her voice just a little too high, just a little too quick, like she was trying to keep control of the narrative. "We had someone come take a look, but it turns out the damage wasn't as serious as we thought, so we were able to take care of it ourselves." My father, sitting beside her, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, staring down at his hands, his silence more telling than anything my mother was saying. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head, could almost hear the frantic calculations she was making, trying to figure out if she had just backed herself into a corner, trying to determine whether or not I had already figured out the truth. I let the silence stretch between us, let the weight of my gaze settle heavily on both of them, let the tension build until I saw the first signs of real panic creeping into my mother's carefully controlled expression. Then I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, tilting my head slightly as if I were considering my next words carefully, as if I were still debating whether or not to say what I was about to say. "That's interesting," I murmured, my voice still calm, still unbothered, still perfectly controlled. "Because I checked your bank statements." My mother's smile froze in place, her breath catching just slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table as my father finally looked up, his face pale, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to speak but couldn't quite find the words. "You used my money to pay for Emily's vacation," I continued, my voice never once rising, my expression never once breaking. "You lied to me, manipulated me, made up a whole story about your house falling apart just so you could send my sister on a trip she didn't even need. And then, when I called you out on it, you had the audacity to act like I was the one being unreasonable." My mother opened her mouth, but I held up a hand, cutting her off before she could even begin her excuse, before she could scramble to spin yet another lie, before she could say anything that might dig her even deeper into the hole she had already buried herself in. "Oh, by the way," I added, reaching for my phone, flicking through the screen as if I were casually checking something, as if what I was about to say wasn't going to send their entire world crashing down around them. "You might want to check your bank account." I let the words sink in, let the uncertainty flash across my mother's face, let my father's fingers twitch slightly against the table before delivering the final blow. "Hope you don't mind a little financial inconvenience," I said, my voice laced with something sharp, something almost cruel, something that tasted like justice on my tongue. "You know, like the one you gave me." The reaction was immediate. My mother scrambled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she tapped at the screen, her breath coming faster as she scrolled through whatever she was seeing. My father leaned over to look, his face going even paler, his expression crumbling into something that almost resembled fear. And I just sat there, watching them sweat, watching them realize that they were no longer in control, watching them finally understand that they had made a mistake they couldn't talk their way out of. My mother's face went pale as she stared at her phone screen, her fingers trembling slightly as she scrolled frantically, her breathing shallow and uneven, her entire demeanor shifting from forced confidence to barely contained panic. My father, who had been silent for most of the dinner, leaned over to look at whatever she was seeing, his expression darkening the moment he registered whatever information was now glaring at them from the bank's app. I didn't need to see it for myself to know exactly what had happened, didn't need to hear them say a single word to confirm that my plan had worked perfectly. The moment I had discovered their betrayal, I knew that simply confronting them wasn't enough, knew that yelling or demanding my money back would only result in another round of excuses. Another carefully crafted sob story designed to make me feel guilty for daring to expect honesty from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. So instead, I had done something much more effective, something that would force them to understand exactly what it felt like to have control ripped away, to have the rug pulled out from under them, to realize too late that they had severely underestimated me. I had reported the transfer as fraudulent. It wasn't even a lie. Not really, because as far as I was concerned, the money had been obtained under false pretenses, had been taken from me through deceit, had been spent on something I never agreed to. My bank had flagged the transaction immediately, had placed a hold on the funds while they investigated, had frozen the transfer before my parents could spend the last of it. And since I had filed an official dispute, claiming that the money had been misused, their credit card company had been notified as well, triggering an automatic security hold on their account. My mother let out a strangled sound, a mix between frustration and disbelief, her carefully maintained composure crumbling as she turned her wide eyes toward me, as if she couldn't quite believe that I had actually done this, as if she had never considered that I might fight back in a way that she couldn't manipulate her way out of. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, her fingers still clenched around the phone like she was afraid to let go of it. I didn't rush to respond, didn't let my expression betray even a hint of satisfaction, didn't give them the reaction they were expecting. Instead, I took a slow sip of my drink, setting the glass down carefully before finally meeting her gaze with a look so calm, so utterly unbothered, that I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. "I don't know what you mean," I said smoothly, tilting my head slightly, watching as my father clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists against the table. "You said the money was for emergency home repairs. So, I figured the safest thing to do was to pay the contractors directly. That way, you wouldn't have to worry about handling it yourselves." My mother blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing as she searched desperately for a way to twist the situation back in her favor, for an argument that would make me feel guilty enough to undo what I had done. My father, on the other hand, seemed to have realized the full extent of the damage, his silence growing heavier, his shoulders sinking lower as the weight of their mistake settled onto him. "You don't understand," my mother finally said, her voice taking on that familiar edge of exasperation, as if I was the one being unreasonable, as if I was making this more difficult than it needed to be. "You can't just freeze our accounts like this. We need that money, we have bills to pay, we have—" "You had $10,000, I interrupted, my voice still cool, still level, still entirely in control. "You had it, and you chose to use it on a vacation instead of the emergency you made up. So, if there aren't any repairs, then I guess you don't need the money, right?" My mother let out a sharp breath, her hands tightening around the edges of the table, her frustration now barely contained, her desperation bleeding through despite her best efforts to keep it hidden. My father finally spoke then, his voice low, strained, barely above a whisper. "We didn't think you'd go this far," he said, his words slow, deliberate, like he was still trying to process the fact that I had completely turned the situation against them. "You've always helped us before, we thought." He trailed off, shaking his head slightly, his disappointment not in himself, but in me, as if I was the one who had somehow let them down. I had no time to respond before my mother's phone buzzed violently against the table, the screen lighting up with a call that made her face drain of all remaining color, her breath catching audibly as she exchanged a glance with my father. I didn't need to see the name flashing across the screen to know exactly who was calling, didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was about to happen. Emily had found out. I leaned back in my chair as my mother hesitated for only a moment before answering, pressing the phone to her ear, barely managing to get out a breathless "Hi, sweetheart," before my sister's voice erupted on the other end, sharp and furious. Her words muffled but unmistakably angry. My mother flinched, her shoulders tensing as she absorbed the full force of Emily's rage, her eyes darting between me and my father as she struggled to come up with a way to calm her down. I already knew what had happened before my mother confirmed it with the panicked look she shot in my direction. Emily's luxury vacation had been cut short. Their credit card had been declined. She had probably been in the middle of some extravagant shopping spree, some over-the-top dining experience, some indulgent spa treatment when the transaction had failed, when she had been informed that there was a problem with the account, when she had realized that she was suddenly out of money. And now she was demanding answers. My father let out a slow, heavy sigh, rubbing a hand over his face, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him. My mother was still stammering into the phone, making weak attempts at placating Emily, promising that they would fix everything, swearing that this was all just a misunderstanding. But I knew, even if they hadn't admitted it out loud yet, that they both finally understood the truth. They had made a mistake, and it was far too late to take it back. My mother's voice was strained as she clutched her phone, her fingers gripping it so tightly that I could see her knuckles turning white. Her entire posture stiff with the kind of tension that only came from knowing she had lost complete control of a situation she once believed was firmly in her grasp. My father sat in rigid silence, his mouth pressed into a tight line, his hands folded in his lap as if he was still trying to calculate some way out of the mess they had created for themselves. His usual quiet detachment now betraying the weight of his realization that this time, there would be no easy fix, no simple excuse, no well-placed guilt trip to make everything go back to the way it was before. Emily's voice, sharp and furious, crackled through the speaker of my mother's phone, her words coming in fast, each one laced with anger, entitlement, and pure disbelief as she demanded an explanation for why her trip had been cut short. Why their credit card had been declined, why she had been left stranded in a foreign country with no access to the endless supply of money she had grown so accustomed to. My mother stammered through weak reassurances, her voice cracking under the pressure, her mind racing for a way to soothe the child she had spent her entire life protecting from consequences, while my father let out a slow, exhausted breath, his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of everything that had finally come crashing down. I didn't say a word at first, didn't interrupt, didn't give them any kind of lifeline, didn't offer them the smallest ounce of comfort as they squirmed under the weight of their own choices, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one holding all the responsibility, wasn't the one bending over backward to fix their mistakes, wasn't the one sacrificing my own well-being for the sake of their selfishness. Instead, I let them feel it, let them sit in the uncomfortable reality they had created, let them finally understand what it meant to be completely powerless in a situation where they had expected to hold all the control. When my mother finally hung up, her hands trembling as she set her phone down on the table, she let out a shaky breath and turned to me with an expression that I had never seen on her face before, something caught between desperation and sheer disbelief. As if she couldn't wrap her mind around the fact that I had actually done this, as if the idea of me standing up for myself was so completely foreign to her that she still believed she could talk me out of it. "Honey, I know you're upset," she began, her voice taking on that familiar, carefully measured tone she always used when she was trying to manipulate me into doing what she wanted. "But don't you think this is a little extreme? We're family, and family is supposed to help each other when times get tough. You know that your father and I have always done everything we could for you, and we never expected you to turn on us like this over something so small." I almost laughed at how predictable she was, how easily she slipped into playing the victim, how quickly she tried to make it seem as though I was the unreasonable one, the cruel one, the one who had somehow wronged them by refusing to be used any longer. My father, always the quieter of the two, let out a heavy sigh and shook his head, finally lifting his gaze to meet mine with something that almost looked like disappointment, as if he had expected better from me. As if my refusal to keep playing their game had somehow let him down. "We're not bad people," he muttered, his voice carrying a quiet sort of resignation, as if he already knew that his words wouldn't change anything. "We didn't mean to hurt you. We thought you wouldn't mind helping out this one time." I exhaled slowly, pressing my palms flat against the table as I leaned forward just enough to let them see the full weight of my determination, my resolve, my absolute refusal to let them get away with this again. "You don't get to use me anymore," I said, my voice steady, my expression unyielding, my words final in a way that left no room for argument. "This ends today. My mother's face crumpled slightly, her lips parting as if she wanted to argue, but she hesitated just a moment too long, as if she finally realized that there was nothing she could say to make me change my mind. My father sat in heavy silence, staring at the table, his fingers twitching slightly as he processed the truth that had been staring him in the face for years, but had never truly registered until now. I wasn't their safety net anymore. Wasn't their endless supply of financial support. Wasn't the daughter they could guilt and manipulate into cleaning up their messes whenever they saw fit. Emily, who had apparently been calling my mother nonstop, finally sent a furious text message that lit up the phone screen between us, the words bold and venomous, dripping with outrage and entitlement. "Are you serious? How could you do this to me? You're so cruel. I hope you're happy ruining my life." I let out a short, humorless laugh as I read it, shaking my head slightly before glancing up at my mother, whose face had gone an even paler shade of white at the sight of the message, as if the reality of the situation had only now fully settled in. "She thinks I'm cruel?" I mused, letting the words roll off my tongue with the kind of dry amusement that barely masked the years of frustration, of resentment, of exhaustion that had been building inside me for far too long. That's funny, considering she's gotten free rides her entire life. My mother looked like she wanted to say something, looked like she wanted to defend Emily the way she always did, but for the first time, the words didn't come as easily as they usually did, as if she had finally run out of excuses, as if she was finally beginning to understand just how much damage she had done. My father, still silent, simply shook his head, his face drawn and weary, as if he was beginning to regret every choice that had led them to this exact moment. I stood up slowly, gathering my things with a deliberate sort of finality, my movements calm, steady, entirely in control. My mother opened her mouth one last time, her expression pleading, her eyes filled with the kind of desperation that told me she was realizing, too late, that I might never come back from this, that she might have pushed me too far, that she might have finally reached the limit she had never thought existed. I glanced between them, taking in the weight of their silence, the stunned expressions on their faces, the undeniable realization that they had lost something they would never be able to buy back. "Maybe you should have treated me like family," I said softly, my voice steady, unwavering, filled with the quiet kind of finality that would linger long after I was gone. "Instead of a bank." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving them behind in the suffocating silence of their own making, leaving them to sit with the consequences of their choices, leaving them to wonder if they would ever get the chance to fix what they had broken.